My friend Neil is around with his 2017 TE300. He's been having some issues with the battery going flat in the hot weather, with the fan running almost constantly. The stator isn't able to supply enough current, and the result is the battery goes flat. So today we're going to be putting in a higher output stator and also a slightly larger battery. So we got an uprated stator kit from TEK. You can see there the part number SR8310, and the kit comes with the stator and also a uprated regulator, and it comes with full install instructions. And this is the uprated lithium battery. You can see there the KTM part number. First step before you do any electrical work on the bike is always disconnect the battery. So we've taken off the ground terminals. To install the new stator, you need to take the case off, and it has different length bolts, and if you get them mixed up it can be an issue. So I've made a template. As I take the bolts out, I'm going to put them in the right hole in my template. The clutch cover, if you put the wrong bolt in the wrong place, it will stop the starter motor turning.
Brilliant.
So every so often you see someone pop up on a forum saying, "Hey, my starter motor won't turn around."
Because they're the wrong one.
And then the first question is, did you install a recluse? Yes.
Whoops.
And you can see there that it looks like there's about 3 different length bolts, so it's a really good idea using a template like this. You can save a lot of time. We're going to take the shift pedal off as well. Make a note of the position so when you put it back on you can put it back easily. So that was maybe a little difficult to see, but there's a connector here, which is a 2-connection one, and on the other side of the frame there's these push fit connectors to the white and yellow wires. And then we can take off the stator. Here you can see the stock stator and the uprated one. You can see the coil winding is a lot thicker on the uprated one, completely different. It's probably twice as thick. So as you saw, the stator is held to the case just with 2 bolts. They're thread locked, so a little tight to get off, but not too difficult. And then it simply lifts off. We're going to clean up the case before we put the new one in. So there's quite a lot of thread lock in the threads where the stator mounts, so I'm going to use a thread chaser and clean that out before I mount the new one. And I'm going to clean off the bolts as well. They've got a lot of thread lock on, so I'm using a thread chaser. Okay, so I've cleaned up the case. I've greased where the Bendix sits in there. I've cleaned the gasket sealing areas carefully and cleaned the threads and also the bolts. So I'm ready to put in the new stator now. It comes with a zip tie holding the cable, so you need to cut that off before you mount it. And then you can install it. And I'm using Loctite 243. Then there's a little metal clip which holds the wiring in position on the case, so be sure to install that correctly. It sits like that. Then before you install the new starter and case, make sure that the sealing surface is clean, so wipe it off. And we're going to be reusing the original gasket. It's a good idea if you have a new one to use that, but this one's still in good shape, so we're going to reuse it. Okay, on the gasket there's two dowels, so make sure they're installed correctly. There's one here and one here. And push them in fully. And then make sure the gasket sits correctly on the case. Okay, so now we're ready to install the new starter. Make sure everything is still clean. And also you want to make sure this clip doesn't fall out when you're putting it on, so be careful about that. And you'll find the magnet pulls it in. And then make sure it's seated correctly on the dowels before you start tightening anything. Okay, that looks good. And then you can start installing the bolts from your template. So initially I like to use a crisscross pattern to tighten them, and then you need to torque all of them to 10 Newton meters. Okay, so I've hand tightened all the bolts, and now I'm ready to torque them to 10 Newton meters. So I'm going to do it in 2 stages and use a crisscross pattern. Okay, so I've gone around once. I'm just going to check all the bolts are torqued to 10 Newton meters. Then you can connect the wiring of the new starter, so just feed it up. Okay, so this side is just this push connector, and it only fits on one way, so that's pretty simple. And then the other side, you need to connect up to the push fit connectors. Okay, so that's the install of the starter complete. Next we need to install the new regulator. Here you can see the original regulator. It's held onto the frame with one bolt and a connector here, so you need to remove that to install a new one. Here you can see the original regulator and the new one, and obviously the new one is a lot larger. One concern is that the original one had this hole and it's mounted to the frame with one bolt, which is kind of okay. The new one has these slots, so if you just use one bolt, there is a chance that because it's quite heavy, it can move and could just drop out. So the solution to come up with is to make this bracket. This will mount behind the regulator, and I can use a bolt on the bottom and then bolt it to the frame, and that means it wouldn't be able to easily drop out. Another difference is the new regulator has these extra wires on, which you need to tie into the starter wiring, so I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so here you can see the bracket mounted on the regulator. I've thread locked this one already, and it's ready to mount to the frame now. And you can see here the hole would prevent it slipping out of the bolt. Okay, so the new regulator is mounted now. It feels nice and solid, and I'm confident it's not easily going to drop off the frame bracket, so I'm pleased with that. Okay, so now I'm going to wire up the new regulator. This is the regulator cabling, so it's got a plug which plugs into the wiring harness plug, so that's easy enough. And then it's got 2 cables here which need to plug into the starter wiring. So coming from your starter, you've got 2 yellow wires. One of the yellow wires, it doesn't matter which one, needs to plug into the white cable on the frame wiring. So I'm going to do that now. Okay, so you can see here I've got one of the yellow wires coming from the starter plugged into the white cable, and then the yellow cable coming from the regulator plugs into the yellow cable coming from the stator. And then the yellow cable coming from the frame plugs into the red and yellow cable coming from the regulator. So that's all the wiring complete. I'm just going to tidy it up, use some cable ties, and hold it securely. Okay, so I've tidied up all the wiring. It looks good now, and I've used a couple of zip ties to hold everything in place. So next we're going to change the battery. So I've already disconnected the ground terminals. I like to disconnect the ground first before the positive. Just be careful you don't short the terminals out, and if you still have the ground terminal connected, be careful not to short the positive to the frame. So here you can see the original battery and the higher capacity battery. I looked up the specs online. The original battery is HJTZ5SFP, and as far as I could tell it's 19 watt hours. And the new one, which is the same number with a C on the end, is 24 watt hours, and it actually states on the battery here. Tip I have for the battery terminals. The way you attach the terminals is a nut goes underneath the terminal, and then you bolt the wire from the top. Because there's a big space down here, the nut can drop down a long way. So a tip I have is using some adhesive backed sponge, cut out a small piece, so a piece like that, stick it on the back of a nut, and then you can slide the nut in, and the sponge holds the nut up against the terminal, so it's very easy to thread in the bolt from above. The original battery also came with some sponge underneath, so I took that sponge off and I've stuck it on the new battery. Okay, so we have the new battery mounted, reconnected the terminals, and we're going to put the tank back on and try starting the bike. Let's start. Looks good.